Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229 for our last class. This is Monday, the 19th of December, and at this point I should be caught up with the discussion form responses. And as you know, I gave an extension for our final journal, which is on The Exorcist. So that will be due today, if you are watching this video on the 19th, by 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, as usual, which is Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And as you know, paper number 2 will be due on Wednesday, the 21st at 8 a.m. And that's also via PDF to my email, Ruiz at gcc.mass.edu, because that is the time in which I will be posting our final exam. So your paper should be done by that point so that you can focus completely on the final. I will be posting it on the 21st at 8 a.m., which is when we would be taking the final if we were meeting in person. If we were meeting in person, you'd have 2 hours for the final. However, since we are meeting online, I will give you 24 hours for the final, but I would expect you to spend approximately 2 hours on the final, certainly not 24. So that final exam will be due a day later on Thursday, the 22nd at 8 a.m., again via PDF to my email. Open book, open note examination, so you can utilize things like journals and your notes and your texts as well. And in terms of the final, I don't expect it to be as neat or as polished as any kind of writing that you would do for a paper, but I'm hoping that you can synthesize the major points and ideas that we've been talking about over the course of the semester. It'll be an essay exam, so I'll give you a series of essay questions and ask you to choose two. So in terms of where we are, we were finishing up our conversation about The Exorcist, and I wanted to draw your attention to the very beginning of the novel, right before the prologue, where we're given some quotations to set the scene. The first is from Luke. When Jesus stepped ashore, there met him a certain man who for a long time was possessed by a devil. Many times he laid hold of him, and he was bound with chains. But he would break the bonds asunder. And Jesus asked him, saying, "What is thy name?" And he said, "Legion." Legion means many, by the way. So many of you had indicated that The Exorcist was loosely based on the story of one particular exorcism of a young boy, actually, in the early 1900s. And I think the change to a girl was very deliberate. First, because it leads to greater possibility for poltergeist phenomenon. And secondly, because the demonic activities seem all the more shocking from a female. And that said, there have been cases of demonic possession that go all the way back to the Bible, which is what's being quoted here. The second is a quote of a conversation of an FBI wiretap, of a telephone conversation relating to a murder of William Jackson. And James Torello says, Jackson was hung up on that meat hook. He was so heavy he bent it. He was on that thing 3 days before he croaked. And Frank Bussieri, giggling, says, Jackie, you should have seen the guy. Like an elephant he was. And when Jimmy hit him with that electric prod, and Torello excitedly says, he was flopping around on that hook, Jackie. We tossed water on him to give the prod a better charge, and he's screaming. And think about the kind of horror that exists in the real world. Horror that isn't necessarily dependent on supernatural intervention. And then finally, second to finally, a Dr. Tom Dooley is quoted as saying, there's no other explanation for some of the things the communists did, like the priest who had 8 nails driven into his skull. And there was the 7 little boys and their teacher. They were praying the Our Father when soldiers came upon them. One soldier whipped out his bayonet and sliced off the teacher's tongue. The other took chopsticks and drove them into the ears of the 7 little boys. How do you treat cases like that? And then references to places like Auschwitz and Dachau. And again, when you think about the real world horrors, perhaps we don't need the supernatural horrors. And this text, even though it is very much in the realm of popular culture, I think also does a very good job of illustrating many of the Gothic themes that we've been talking about over the course of this semester. Think about something like isolation. And not only is Marin in some ways isolated because he is on archaeological digs, not only is Damien are isolated because, again, he talks a little bit about the loneliness of the priesthood. Um, but Chris McNeil is also isolated just because, again, she lives in a world of wealth and privilege. And being an actor, she very much has to separate herself from her fans. And that's always struck me about Regan, that she's continually surrounded by adults, but never by children her own age, which of course leads to the possibility of ambiguity, which we've seen throughout the course of the semester, that perhaps the events that occur to Regan are supernatural in nature, perhaps they are poltergeist in nature, perhaps they are psychological in nature. The doctors talk about whether or not they could be physiological in nature. But again, I think it's less of a focus on what happens to Regan and more of a focus on what happens to those individuals around her, specifically, as the title suggests, the two exorcists, but more importantly, that scene at the very ending of the novel where Karis and Marin are talking about the purpose of possession, which is to torment those who are witness to possession. And it always strikes me that at the ending of the novel, when Damien flings himself out of the window, so many passerbys just ignore him, assuming that he's a drunk. And again, the real world evils are perhaps much greater than anything a Pazuzu could ever bring forth. So this leads us to finally the way we began, which is with Stephen King. You remember we read pieces of Danse Macabre where he was trying to lay out some of the elements associated with the Gothic. And he's probably best known for his novel writing, but his novels tend to be quite long. I didn't think we had it in us to read a novel. If we had, I probably would have assigned The Shining. But nevertheless, I had indicated to several of you that Stephen King's inspiration for the Overlook Hotel in The Shining was none other than Hill House from The Haunting of Hill House. But I thought that even getting a taste of a couple of his short stories would give you an idea of his writing style. Though I think you saw his writing style in Danse Macabre as well, that it tends to be quite informal and quite colloquial. Which I think is one of the reasons why he was able to revive the Gothic. As many of you indicated, that it is a bit of a challenge reading Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, if for no other reason because of the archaic language. But Stephen King puts his stories usually in the here and the now and utilizes our language, so he makes them quite accessible. But if you know anything about the genre, which at this point I hope you do, you'll see that he uses many of the elements and was inspired by many of them. His foreword, which I had assigned for you to read, sounds like Danse Macabre. It's reiterating many of the major points that we talked about at the beginning of the semester, including the fact that horror is so maligned in part because it brings us news of death, the one topic that most people want to avoid, and that horror texts from his perspective serve as filters between the conscious and the unconscious mind. So you could read them from an allegorical or symbolic perspective, as I've been trying to do and we've been trying to do over the course of the semester. And I gave you two short stories about vampires because of, if no other reason, Dracula is so iconic in the genre. And Jerusalem's Lot, which actually formed the basis of his later novel, Salem's Lot, that you might be aware of, which is an updated tale of vampires in Salem's Lot. But Jerusalem's Lot was very much paying homage to Dracula and to the other older Gothic texts. You can see that it's written in the epistolary format of journals and letters. You can see that we're in the 1800s. You can see that we are in an isolated area, a bad home with a dark history. Rats are in the wall, which is actually a nod to Lovecraft because Lovecraft did write a story about rats in the wall. A mysterious cellar, lots of historical lore, again, things that we've become accustomed to with like The Haunting of Hill House. References to Anne Radcliffe, who was actually a Gothic writer in the very beginning of the genre, where we were talking about Horace Walpole and the Castle of Otranto. Church desecrations, that's something that we talked about with The Exorcist. Nosferatu, something that of course was referenced in Dracula. Incest and interbreeding, that's something that we've seen with Poe and Lovecraft. Whippoorwills, we know them from Lovecraft. Yog-Sothoth, and of course that's Lovecraft as well. The idea of a hereditary evil, and in fact that's one of the elements of the Gothic where it seems that the past is continually invading upon the present. But if that short story was not to your liking, there's another short story entitled One for the Road that is his updated vampire tale that's set in Maine, as Stephen King oftentimes sets his stories in because he's from Maine itself. And he talks about the nor'easter, and I think that we as New Englanders understand just how vicious and monstrous those nor'easters can be and how isolating as well. And in a bar, they talk a little bit about, well, Jerusalem's Lot. So you can see how Stephen King is trying to create a folklore, much in the way that we've got authors like Lovecraft who've tried to create a folklore as well. You note that I don't have a journal assigned for you with Stephen King short stories. I kind of see them as a bonus, if you will. Which means that there's no attendance question for today either, that our last major text would be The Exorcist, though that's not to say that certainly the Gothic tradition has not flourished since then. In terms of our assignments, again, journal number 7 on The Exorcist is going to be due today, the 19th, 11:59 p.m. Paper number 2, which would be on the later set of readings in the semester, will be due Wednesday, the 21st at 8 a.m. And the final exam will be posted on Wednesday, the 21st at 8 a.m. And you will have 24 hours to complete it. So the only thing that's left is for you to watch a very brief video that I have in the 5th section in the notes below. It's a farewell message from a friend of mine. And that said, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on with our final exam next class. Take care. Bye.